Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another lecture in the Remembering and Forgetting series of London lectures brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. It is a great pleasure to welcome our speaker for this evening, Lucy Allais. Lucy trained in Oxford, where she did a BPhil and a DPhil. She is known for her work both on Kant, especially his transcendental idealism, and also on forgiveness. She has held posts at the University of Sussex, University of California at San Diego, among other places, and she is currently Miller Professor of Philosophy at Johns Hopkins University and also Professor in the Philosophy Department at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. So Lucy's talk tonight will be on forgiveness. Do we need? Lucy, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. And thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be here. So the overall theme of this lecture series is remembering and forgetting. What should we remember, when and how should we remember, and what is best forgotten? And forgiveness is obviously interestingly linked to both remembering and forgetting. So my focus in thinking about these issues is going to be on the question of what forgiveness is, and how this illuminates whether and how we might need it, and how that might help us to remember well and to think about what and how we should remember. So there's an enormous amount of self-help literature and internet wisdom on the question of forgiveness. There are thousands of supposedly inspirational quotes you can find on the theme of forgiveness on the internet. That's not true of my other subject matter, Kant's metaphysics. There appear inspirational quotes. So a common theme of internet inspirational quotes about forgiveness is that forgiveness is something you do to free yourself. And I think that's questionable. So for one thing, I think that forgiveness is centrally about you in relation to the person who's wronged you, or if you're wanting forgiveness, the person you've wronged. And there seems to be something problematic about making it all about yourself and your own good. And of course, it is helpful and important to not be endlessly eaten up by dwelling on resentment. But forgiveness is not the only way of achieving this. There are lots of important alternatives. You can reconcile with someone and move forward with them without forgiving them. Acceptance can be an important alternative to forgiving. And you can stop dwelling on resentment without forgiving. You can just put somebody out of your mind and thoughts. And that can often be a healthy and important thing too. So one part of my answer to the question of do we need forgiveness is to push back on the internet wisdom theme and argue that we don't always need forgiveness, but we don't have to forgive in many instances, and that we don't need to forgive to free ourselves. But I do think there's something genuinely very special and powerful about forgiveness. And I do think it's something we need in our lives and relationships, if not in every case. And I think that seeing this requires understanding what forgiveness is, but also what we are, what kinds of agents we are. And I'll come to that a bit at the end, but to give you a clue, deeply flawed ones. Okay, so there are very many questions one can ask about forgiveness. There are just sort of practical questions, like how do you actually go about forgiving someone? And then there are sort of more philosophical questions, like can we forgive the dead? Can you forgive someone in your heart without telling them that you've forgiven them? Does forgiveness require that the wrongdoer has made apologies and amends? Or, on the other hand, can you forgive unconditionally without the wrongdoer having to do anything? Can you forgive someone? Can you think you've forgiven someone and then realize that you haven't? So I'm going to come back to some of these, but I want to start with the most basic philosophical question: what even is forgiveness? So philosophers are always asking, what does that even mean? The questions which sometimes seem rather basic to everybody else. The American philosopher Thomas Nagel once said that all the big philosophical questions have been asked by children under the age of 5. So sometimes this has the result that normal people don't quite see the point of the problem that philosophers also are puzzled by. But I think that part of what philosophy contributes is showing us that some phenomena we take for granted might be more puzzling and interesting than we thought they were when we try to really unpack them. So philosophers argue about what forgiveness is. So philosophers have thought that there's something paradoxical about forgiveness. And you might think that this supposed paradox is one of those instances of philosophers scratching an itch that only philosophers have. But I want to try to persuade you that there's something genuinely puzzling about forgiveness. And also, I think that what makes it puzzling is key to understanding what it is and why we need it. So I'm going to outline some reasons philosophers have had for thinking that there's something puzzling about forgiveness. I want to look at some of the things that philosophers have said trying to solve the problem and why I think they don't really work. And then I want to try to persuade you that the puzzle is real. And then I'll say something about why I think there is something genuinely special and strange about forgiveness. So Derrida puts it maximally paradoxically, saying you can only forgive the unforgivable. Most philosophers don't hold this, but many do think that there's something really quite deeply puzzling about forgiveness. Hannah Arendt says, trespassing is an everyday occurrence, and it needs forgiving, dismissing, in order to make it possible for life to go on by constantly releasing men from what they have done. Only through this constant mutual release from what they do can men remain free agents. Only by constant willingness to change their minds and start again can they be trusted with so great a power as that to begin something anew. So that's not quite as extreme as Derrida, but it's still pretty puzzling. How do we release people from what they've done as if we were God with the power to absolve people? It's actually pretty puzzling even to think about what it would be for God to make it the case that you haven't done something. Does releasing people from what they've done mean not taking wrongdoing sufficiently seriously? And the idea that only through doing this can we remain free agents seems like a particularly extreme claim. But I think there's actually something to what Arendt is saying, and I'm going to come back to this. Okay, so a first take on motivating the idea that there's something puzzling or paradoxical about forgiveness. Lots of people think that forgiveness involves overcoming anger or blame towards the wrongdoer. Okay, so forgiveness involves ceasing to blame or ceasing to hold something against someone. But if blaming means holding the person responsible, then forgiveness involves not ceasing to blame. Because if you cease to see them as responsible, there's nothing to forgive. If there's something to forgive, blame is appropriate. So forgiveness seems to give up blame that is appropriate or warranted. But shouldn't we have appropriate feelings or judgments? Does this make forgiveness involve an unrealistic way of seeing people? Does it make it irrational? Another way into the puzzle is to think about the following 2 points. So we've said that forgiveness involves overcoming anger and blame. But a lot of philosophers think that not just any way of overcoming anger and blame count. So lots of people think, for example, so forgiveness involves a change of heart on this count, a change of the way you're feeling towards the wrongdoer if you're ceasing to be angry towards them. But lots of philosophers say not just a random, unmotivated change of heart. If you overcome anger towards someone by taking a pill, or being hit on the head, or being hypnotized, lots of philosophers think that doesn't count. So do we need a particular account of a specific way in which anger and blame must be overcome in order for it to be forgiveness? And another point that philosophers are worried about is that forgiveness needs to be different from excusing, justifying, and accepting. So we sometimes talk loosely in ways that run these all together, but they're quite importantly different, I think. So suppose you're angry with me. I was late to meet you. But then I give you a really plausible excuse. So you come to see that it wasn't my fault. The whole transport system broke down because of bad weather. There was absolutely nothing I could do. It's a completely illegitimate excuse. It's not, I didn't do anything wrong. It's not my fault. Okay, so hopefully you stop blaming me and your anger might disappear. Or you could be angry with me, but I show you that what I did was justified in the circumstances. I had to rush someone to hospital in an emergency. Once you understand that, you'll agree that while it looked wrong, actually it was justified, and so it didn't actually do anything wrong. And you'll see that there isn't anything to be angry about. So justifying is another way of ceasing to blame. And accepting is also an important way of giving up blame. So sometimes you just need to get over yourself and see that a little bit of lateness is not actually that serious. It's not the worst thing in the world. Shift to this person is stop demanding that they be anything different. They're not going to change. So you stop holding into account, you stop demanding anything different from them. So accepting, justifying, and excusing are all really important. Many of us are liable to get angry too quickly, to over-evaluate and exaggerate other people's faults or offenses against us, and making peace with people's foibles is essential in a relationship. Accepting, justifying, and excusing are all ways of changing or overcoming anger and blame through coming to see that there is nothing to forgive. There don't is nothing to forgive when there is unexcused, unjustified, unacceptable wrongdoing, which might be what Derrida's getting at in saying that we can only forgive the unforgivable. So forgiveness is in play only when there is warranted anger and blame. So blame and anger are warranted, but you give them up and you cease holding the act against the wrongdoer. But what does this ceasing to hold it against them actually involve? It doesn't involve ceasing to think that they did it. It doesn't involve ceasing to think that it was wrong, because that's necessary for there to be something to forgive. Okay, so to go back to the puzzle, so we said you're ceasing to blame, but if blame is holding responsible, you're not ceasing to blame. So you might think, well, maybe this is two different senses of blame. Maybe you're ceasing to be angry while continuing to judge that the person did it. So maybe we can distinguish between the feeling from some kind of judgment of responsibility. But I think that this is called puzzling. This called for raises puzzle. So to see this, I think we need just a little bit of background about the nature of forgiveness, as well as about the nature of emotions. So one thing I think that we often think about forgiveness is that there's something gifted about it. There's something wrong, I think, with a wrongdoer demanding forgiveness, or asserting that you have to forgive them now, or asserting their entitlement to forgiveness. So another way to put this is that I think forgiveness is not typically a matter of giving the wrongdoer something they deserve or are entitled to. There's nothing generous about it. It goes beyond what a wrongdoer is entitled to insist that they deserve. Closely related to this, I think there's something often praiseworthy about forgiveness. And related to that, forgiveness isn't a non-rational phenomenon. Forgiveness is done, least often, for reasons. It would be harder to understand it as praiseworthy, as virtuous, if it wasn't done for reasons, which was sort of something non-rational. So I've been talking about forgiveness as a change of heart, a change of feeling, so it's overcoming anger. And that, I think, requires a little bit of background about how we think about emotions. So both philosophers and psychologists, I think that emotion is not something that is simply or straightforwardly opposed to reason. So emotions have relations to other psychological states, like beliefs. And so one way philosophers thought this is to say that emotions have content. So an emotion is like being angry with someone is different to something like an itch. An itch isn't about something. But my anger has an object. If I'm angry with you, you're the object of my anger. And it has a way that it presents you. If I'm angry with you for being late, my anger presents you in a particular way. It's a way of seeing you. It's a way of seeing you as having done something wrong. And the way I'm seeing you when I'm angry with you has relation to beliefs. And this means that we can sometimes get rid of anger by changing beliefs. So I'm angry with you for being late. You tell me that you were delayed by something incredibly important, or that I had the time on. That my anger might disappear. This doesn't always work, of course. Emotions can fail to respond to a change in beliefs. They can have irrational residues. And in the extreme case of phobias, emotions can be just cognitively impenetrable. But you know that this thing isn't dangerous, but still this bird or whatever it is presents itself to you as dangerous. But the possibility of some emotions that are completely cognitively impenetrable, like phobias, doesn't show that all emotions are like this. On the contrary, it highlights a contrast with emotions that are cognitively penetrable. So emotions present the world to us in particular charged ways. And the way they present the world can be apt. So fear presents its objects as dangerous in a particular charged, vivid, urgent way. And this can be appropriate. Some things are dangerous and urgently so. So mental states that present them in that way can be warranted or appropriate. We don't evaluate emotions as true or false the way we do beliefs, but we do evaluate them. We talk about them as being appropriate or inappropriate, proportionate or disproportionate. And these evaluations are related to how the emotion presents its object. So when we say things like, come on, don't be so angry, she was only a little bit late, you're overreacting. That's a judgment about the disproportionateness of anger. Or if we say things like, I really understand why you're so angry with me. I know this is the 5th time this week I've kept you waiting. This is an acknowledgement that anger is warranted, that it makes sense, that it presents its object in an appropriate way. So so emotions have objects, and anger and blaming emotions can be warranted and appropriate. And one thing that seems to make them warranted and appropriate is wrongdoing. They're an appropriate response to wrongdoing. And this idea is key, I think, to what forgiveness is, but also to what makes it puzzling. Forgiveness is thought to involve ceasing to have or overcoming blaming attitudes that wrongdoing warrants or makes appropriate. So when we try to put these different features of forgiveness together, it becomes quite hard to see how they can all fit together. And that's, I think, part of the puzzle. So we considered a response which said that forgiveness is just a change in feelings, that it doesn't involve changing judgments because feelings aren't rational. But emotions do have content that they can be evaluated as warranted or unwarranted. Another thing we could say is that forgiveness involves overcoming excess anger and resentment rather than warranted anger and resentment. But this doesn't seem particularly praiseworthy or gifted or generous. And it does seem like something that a wrongdoer can insist on. You're entitled to say that somebody shouldn't be completely disproportionately angry with you. Another response is to say that perhaps anger and blame are just bad things and we shouldn't have them. Or, that you shouldn't judge, that judgment is a bad thing. In response to these kinds and some philosophers have defended this, Martha Nussbaum defends that. But many philosophers have done an enormous amount of work defending an appropriate role for anger and blame in our lives. So this goes back a long way, at least to Aristotle, who's famous for defending appropriate anger. Aristotle says, a man who does not get angry when there is reason to be angry, or does not get angry in the right way, at the right time and with the right people, is adult. A little bit more recently, which was from Miranda Fricker, depends on account of what she calls constructive blame, which accuses the wrongdoer of fault with an aim of getting them to see or fully acknowledge the significance of what they've done or failed to do. And she says, because the aim of constructive blame is to communicate with someone who's failed to appropriately respond to some moral consideration, its proper form is arguing with emotional force, aimed at promoting greater alignment between the moral understandings of the blamer and the blamee. So I think that wanting someone to recognize, for example, that they've hurt you, need not involve problematic thoughts of payback or the desire for them to suffer. It need not involve thoughts about judgment or superiority, intolerance, which are all things that worry people about anger and judgment. It could just involve wanting them to understand and care about the fact that they've hurt you. So the desired outcome may not be that they abase themselves, but rather increased understanding, alignment of values, and being known. So if you make a blame like that, something like Africa does, I think that never having blaming attitudes to others would involve never seeing them as responsible and accountable for their actions, or not caring about what their actions say about how they see you. Of course, there are all sorts of bad and disproportionate ways to blame. That's easy to see. There are all sorts of pathologies of blaming. But done carefully and well, I think that blame is a central part of how we hold each other accountable and actually keep each other sane. So going back to our suggestion that anger and blame might be bad things that we shouldn't have, I think the more work philosophers have done to show possible constructive roles for anger and blame, the harder it gets to make sense of giving up warranted anger and blame. Okay, so our puzzle is with what makes it rational and praiseworthy to give up warranted blame. And, now suppose blame has done its work. So you've communicated blame well, in Fricker's best ways. The wrongdoer has understood, they've listened, they've taken responsibility, they acknowledge your concern, they take it seriously, they apologize, and they undertake to change. So you answer, well, doesn't that make giving up blame appropriate? So a central strategy that philosophers have for making sense of the overcoming blame that forgiveness involves is to say that forgiveness requires the wrongdoer to do something to change the situation that made blame appropriate. So apologies, recompense, making amends, undertaking to change, these are often what make forgiveness a life possibility. And this vindicates the idea that forgiveness is done for reasons. So the idea is wrongdoing makes blame and anger warranted or appropriate. Apologies and amends change the situation, give us new information, and make it the case that blaming attitudes are no longer appropriate. So on this account, proper forgiveness is conditional. It depends on the wrongdoer having done this stuff. Now, I agree that apologies and making amends provide grounds for forgiveness, but I think there's something problematic about this strategy for dissolving the puzzle. On this count, apologies and amends make it the case that blaming attitudes are no longer warranted. So on this count, forgiveness actually involves giving up unwarranted anger and blame that is no longer warranted or appropriate. But it's hard to see that there's anything particularly special, praiseworthy, virtuous, or generous about giving up anger and blame that's no longer warranted. And it looks like this might be something that the wrongdoer is entitled to insist on. So highly conditional accounts of forgiveness, I think, rule out significant cases in which people take themselves to be forgiving. They rule out forgiving the dead, which I take to be a real possibility. They rule out unconditional forgiveness, which is something people certainly take themselves to do, and it's often regarded as very praiseworthy. And it puts forgiveness, I think, in the space of careful account keeping, which I think is not the space where forgiveness should be, and it's very far from understanding it as this powerful, amazing thing that the inspirational internet thinks it is. So I think there's a common theme. It intends to dissolve the puzzle, but the apparently paradoxical nature of forgiveness. The attempts to dissolve the puzzle often seem to dissolve the phenomenon. So we started with something that's supposed to be this amazing special thing that plays this powerful role in our lives and relationships, and that is gifted and generous, can't be demanded. But in order to make sense of it, we reduce it to overcoming emotions we shouldn't have. But that doesn't seem particularly special or powerful or generous. Okay, so to take stock a little bit, our puzzle is with what makes it rational and praiseworthy to give up warranted blame. To say that forgiveness is a mere change of heart, to say that the feelings aren't rational, it's changing in non-rational feelings doesn't help, because emotions have content that can be warranted. Overcoming excess resentment and anger doesn't seem particularly praiseworthy. Anger and blame, I think, are not intrinsically bad and can have positive roles to play in our lives. And making forgiveness highly conditional makes it either not generous and praiseworthy or not rational. So one way of putting the apparent paradox is that it seems when we try to characterize the change that forgiveness involves, it always turns out to be either, on the one hand, irrational and maybe even impossible, like Derrida says we can only forgive the unforgivable, or unnecessary and trivial. So either, if forgiveness involves ceasing to see a wrong as attaching to the wrongdoer, but without changing the judgment about their culpability, it seems irrational. It seems to involve seeing somebody incorrectly. But if a change in how you see her is warranted, perhaps she's repented and atoned and done what's possible to undo the wrong, there's nothing more to do than to recognize this. So what does forgiveness add to just, you're making your judgments match apportioned to the evidence of the world? This might fuel the suspicion that some people have that forgiveness is a kind of religious hangover that can't be made sense from a secular point of view. Yeah, but I want to try to bend the secular account of forgiveness. And I want one that takes the features that make forgiveness puzzling seriously and doesn't just try to dissolve them away, which I think a lot of philosophical accounts are guilty of doing. So I'll just mention that given all these sort of problems with characterizing a change of heart, another response some philosophers have had to this question is just to say that we shouldn't think of forgiveness as a change of heart, but to think that it's something else. So rather than thinking that it's change in how you feel towards the wrongdoer and not being angry with them anymore, perhaps it's something you say to them, like they say, I forgive you, as you say, I accept that, or it's something that you do in relation to the wrongdoer, so like you stop punishing them or stop requiring them to apologize. So there were various philosophers who give accounts of forgiveness that involve appealing to things you can say and do. Now, these are all clearly things that have a role to play in the aftermath of wrongdoing. I've got reasons for thinking that I wouldn't characterize those as forgiveness, including the idea that I think you could forgive someone in your heart without telling them. I think you can forgive the dead and various other things, but I'm not going to argue against these now. I'll just say I want to make sense of a change of heart. So if you think that forgiveness is these other things, then there's still something that's worth thinking about in the change of heart. And I want to show why it plays an important role in our lives. It's not just a sort of subjective feeling that doesn't really matter. It's actually something really important to us. So another response you might have to the problem is to say that forgiveness involves separating the wrongdoer from their actions in the way you see them. So maybe not seeing them as all bad, not seeing the wrong as characterizing everything about them, or maybe withholding judgment and ceasing to judge. I think there's something to these ideas, but they're hard to make precise. Holding something against someone doesn't require seeing her as all bad. So I can hold something against someone I love and regard as overall a really good person. In fact, that might make the particular way they hurt me seem worse. And you can hold something against someone while seeking to be angry with them. So picture somebody who says to you, I'm not angry with you. I never think about you at all. Ergo, here's many contempt. You're not going to feel forgiven that way. So what seems to me key here is although they're not angry, their attitude towards you is still informed by the thing you did. And that, I think, is they are still holding it against you. And that's what I'm interested in, this affective or feeling involving holding against, where somebody's attitude is still informed by the thing you did. So I'm interested in this holding against insofar as it concerns feelings, and that's what I want to make sense of, to understand its role in our lives and to understand how we can change it. So to think about this a bit more, I think it's helpful to think a little bit more about the nature of the relevant emotions. Okay, so some of the philosophers who want forgiveness to be something other than feelings will say, oh, feelings are just like these little inner things. What matters is the things we do and say. And I just want to know first that in addition to not being opposed to reasons, emotions are absolutely central to everything that makes life worth living. So there is no caring about anything without emotion, because caring evokes feeling. And then there is, what I want to look at in a bit more detail, is there's a particular class of emotions that philosophers have been very interested in. Emotions or feeling involving attitudes, so affective attitudes, because they're feeling involving attitudes, which are responses to people's actions. So think about blame, resentment, contempt, guilt, but also gratitude and trust. These are all attitudes to persons that involve feeling. So they're affective attitudes. That's the most technical term. Is affective attitudes. The attitudes that involve feelings. And they've got really complex content. They're feelings or attitudes, affective feeling involving attitudes that we have towards persons, philosophers call moral agents, free and responsible beings that understand and can respond to reasons for actions. So they're not typically attitudes we have to inanimate causes like gravity or the weather. They're attitudes to the free agency of persons, what persons intentionally do in the light of what we were reasonably entitled to expect them to do. So I think when you resent someone, roughly, you see them as having done something you were entitled to expect them not to do, and that they could have not done the same. And when you feel gratitude to someone, roughly, you see them as having done you more good than you were entitled to expect them to do you, and also that they didn't have to do this. This was something that they chose to do. They did freely. Trust is another affective attitude to another person's agency. When you trust someone, roughly, you see them as reliably and competently showing goodwill to you in taking account of your reliance on them. So it's actually very complicated. Philosophers also argue about what trust is. So these affective attitudes, these feeling-involving attitudes to persons, I think involve appraisals of persons. So they evaluate persons in ways that are informed by their actions, or in the light of their actions. And these attitudes are really, really important to us. They make up a huge part of our emotional lives and relationships, what we care about most. So sometimes people say that we shouldn't judge, but our only basis for knowing anything about anyone's character, moral responses, and motivations is what they do, including things that they tell us. And if we don't ever take what a person does as telling us something about them and appraise them in the light of that, I think we're not taking them seriously as a person. We're not seeing them as making choices. We're not seeing their actions as flowing from their choosing, their responding to reasons. So I think that these attitudes are central to moral life. And they're part of how we hold each other accountable and help each other develop. A number of philosophers talk about them as playing an essential role in scaffolding moral agency. So in supporting and developing our agency with each other through the ways that we treat each other as responsible, hold each other to account, blame and appreciate each other in relation to our actions. And I think this is part of how we develop and maintain our interpersonal social agency, which is what our agency is, interpersonal and social. In African philosophy, you will often draw on a saying which exists in a number of sub-Saharan African languages, which is translated as a person is a person to other persons. That's the Zulu version. And this is sometimes understood in terms of a communal account of moral life. But it's also sometimes understood metaphysically as a claim about what persons are, so an interpersonal account of personhood. And I think that these emotional attitudes of affectively seeing each other in the light of our actions bring out something essentially right about that. Our moral agency is an essentially interpersonal phenomenon through which we make ourselves and each other. And when we reflect on the role of these attitudes in our lives, I think we can see why the change in feeling is something significant. It's not just sort of some epiphenomenal change unrelated to the world. These emotions are a central part of how we form ourselves and each other. So I think that one part of getting clear about what forgiveness is getting clear about the content of the emotions it overcomes. The way the emotions of forgiveness overcomes hold something against someone. But think back to the person who says, I'm no longer angry, but I'll never see you in the same way again. So I think they haven't forgiven you because the wrongdoing still informs their affective appraisal of you as a person. So I'll never see you in the same way again. I think you're beneath contempt. But the thing you did informs the way they are affectively appraising you. And I think that so long as the wrongdoing informs the affective appraisal of the person, you're holding the actual against that. You haven't forgiven that. But the way I think about what forgiveness is that it involves overcoming or ceasing to have the affective appraisals that wrongdoing works. This, I think, is what it is to stop holding something against someone. And if you think forgiveness is something else, which some philosophers do, I would just submit that this ceasing to hold things against someone, ceasing to let the thing that they've done inform the way you affectively appraise it, is something important to us, something important to our lives. And it's worth making sense of philosophically. But now you might think, aren't we back with the problem, in fact, in an even worse version? So if we should see people in a way that their actions weren't seeing them, it looks like forgiveness either involves seeing them in an unwarranted way, or it involves just recognizing something we ought anyway to recognize. Doesn't seem courteous or discretionary. Of course, we don't know for sure what it's like inside anybody else. We don't know what their struggles are. Maybe it's harder for them to be kind than it is for other people. We ought to be cautious in how we judge, but we've got nothing to go on in appraising people other than their actions. And if we don't take their actions as informing, as reflecting on who they are, at least some of the time, and informing how we see them, I think we're not taking them seriously as persons, as agents. We're not seeing their actions as flowing on their choices. So now you might think that paying attention to the content of these affective appraisals makes the problem worse. So if you think about why apologies and amends make forgiveness a life possibility, you've done this wrong thing, but now in apologizing, you're repudiating the wrong thing. So that gives me a reason to see it as not reflecting on you. You repudiated it. But an apology is far from proof that you've changed. So doesn't show that the wrong doesn't still reflect on you, at least to some degree. So suppose I stop being angry, I'm willing to move forward with you, I accept that you're sorry, but I file away in my mental accounts that this was something you were willing to do. You were willing and able to bring yourself to do. Not dwelling on it disproportionately. I don't see it as characterizing all of you. I don't see you as old or bad. And I've got this little mental chip mark against you, my little black book, my mental bookkeeping. In my view, this is precisely holding something against someone. And I think it's not unreasonable. Saying sorry doesn't fix damage often. And being sorry is not the same as having changed. Kant says if improvement were a matter of mere washing, every human would be good. So if we think back to conditional accounts of forgiveness, if the wrongdoer really has to show that the wrongdoing should no longer inform someone's appraisal of them, I think these conditions are more demanding than most proponents of conditional accounts realize. Because it requires more than apologies and amends, and more than just undertaking to be different, but require really showing that you're different. And that's really hard to do. And to the extent that it can be shown, it again diminishes the extent to which forgiveness is praiseworthy or in any way generous. It's just a matter of extreme calibration in your mental bookkeeping. Your attitudes to the wrongdoer are precisely calibrated to exactly what she's shown through her initial wrongdoing and subsequent actions. So forgiveness isn't puzzling or irrational, but it's also not special, praiseworthy, or generous. Dissolves the puzzle, but also dissolves the thing we're trying to explain, rules out forgiving the dead, or anybody who's done less than what you're required to really hear that they've changed. Okay, so now you might think at this point, do we really need forgiveness? We've got all the other things, except justifying and accusing and having appropriate attitudes. But I want to try to argue that we do. And I think that apologies and making amends do make sense of forgiveness in many cases, and I think you're entitled to require them. But I also think that you can forgive the dead. I think you can forgive without apologies and recompense, so I don't think you have to require them. And I think that even when there are apologies and recompense, forgiveness involves going beyond what the wrongdoer is entitled to assert that they deserve. Okay, so I've said that, on my view, Forgiving involves giving up blaming attitudes and appraisals that the wrongdoing warrants, and that this typically goes beyond what the wrongdoer is able to demonstrate that they deserve. What makes this not irrational and potentially praiseworthy, I think, is the kinds of moral agents that we are. This is also, I think, the same thing that explains why we need it. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about how I think the kinds of agents that we are helps us understand what forgiveness is and why we need it. And I'm not going to really argue for my account of the kinds of agents that we are. I'm just going to sort of sketch it to show you why I think we need forgiveness. Okay, so I said that I don't think that forgiveness is essentially religious. I think we can, never mind essentially Christians, and I think we can make perfectly good secular sense of it. But I don't think that it's a coincidence that it's at home in a Christian context. And there are a number of philosophers who've, made something out of the idea that it doesn't feature a lot in the ancient world, that it's not something that they think is part of the culture of the ancient world, in the ancient Mediterranean. Because, so I think that this makes sense because of the view Christianity has of the kinds of agents that we are. So on the one hand, I think deeply or fundamentally flawed, and on the other hand, not fixed or set in stone, free to make better choices. So I think that forgiveness is possible and important for agents who are all, to some degree, a mess, not properly ordered, constantly having to make choices, forming ourselves by the choices that we make, not able to overcome some of what makes us flaws, but still able to make better choices. So in contrast, think about the virtuous agents of classical virtue theory. So properly having Aristotelian virtue means seeing what the right thing to do is easily, doing the right thing easily and even with enjoyment, and not being tempted. On this account, somebody who's merely strong in the face of temptation is not fully virtuous. They're just continent. The truly virtuous person wouldn't be tempted. They don't need to be strong in the face of temptation. On the pessimistic view of human nature that I think is more typical of Christianity and also philosophers like Kant, continence, in the ancient sense, is the best that human agents have to hope for. We are a mess of competing inclinations, desires, insecurities, hostilities, anxieties, and we don't find doing the right thing easy or something that flows from our natures. People sometimes say things like, nobody's perfect, in a passive-aggressive way, that is almost a refusal to take wrongdoing seriously. So like, you can't expect me to be better than this. Don't hold me to unreasonable standards. Nobody's perfect. But the way I understand it, the idea is not just that we aren't perfect, but that we're systematically, structurally flawed. So I think it's different to ways in which we're less than perfect navigators or calculators or cooks. I also actually find the idea that humans are structurally flawed compelling, and I think it's something that can be made sense of from a secular point of view. So it's at home in certain religious points of view, but I think we can make sense of it. So I'm just going to very briefly sketch a way that I make sense of it, but I'm not going to be really arguing for this in a lot of detail. Okay, so firstly, I think it's a fundamental feature of our agency that we need to interpret ourselves as basically good. We need to see ourselves as justified, as making sense. I think, and I'm not going to go into this here, but I think this actually follows from the nature of morality and the nature of rational agency, for complicated reasons partly developed by Kant. Rational agency involves acting for reasons. Acting for reasons involves thinking that your reasons make sense. So I think we deeply need to make sense, to understand ourselves as making sense and as unified and coherent. There are lots of ways in which we aren't perfect, or in which we're even quite bad, that don't matter in the same way. So I am no good at running, no good at singing, pretty poor at navigating. Accepting these things is not threatening in the same way as seeing yourself as not coherent, not making sense, not oriented to the good.
I think that this is a basic feature of agency. And I think it interacts with three other features of our agency and situation, which I'll just briefly sketch. So the first thing is the basic nature of our motivational system, the way we experience desire, which involves radically discounting future happiness. So even if we were rational utility maximizers at any particular moment, we're not at all good at choosing what we, so if we were at any particular moment just always choosing what we think would make us most happy reliably, we're not at all good at doing that over time. So psychology has spent quite a lot of time studying this, but our motivational system overvalues immediate pleasures. And this means that having any plans at all involves getting yourself to do something in the face of something else which your motivation system judges to be currently more worth doing. This requires all sorts of strategies, like giving yourself rules and principles. And these principles easily become fetishized and rigid. And that's another kind of psychological trap. And they stop us from being able to enjoy the present. So there's an enormous amount to be said about this. It raises lots of complicated issues. But basically, managing yourself in such a way as to not always give in to short-term pleasures, but still being able to enjoy short-term pleasures is actually quite a difficult challenge. And I think it might actually be impossible to get entirely right. Okay. Then put that together with the second factor, the kinds of considerations that psychoanalysis is concerned with, the ways in which coming to moral agency, or even just social life, starting as a non-rational infant creature, involves learning, constantly learning, ways in which your desires are problematic and require controlling. And this often involves shame, which easily threatens a sense of yourself as coherent and good, and therefore triggers defenses. So learning to control yourself, to give appropriate weight to the needs of others, to share, basic things we have to learn to have a social existence, involves learning that you've done things that are wrong, that some of your desires are problematic, and this can threaten understanding yourself as good and lovable and making sense, which I think is necessary for agency. And then put those two things together with the fact that we always come into existence in problematic conditions or societies which don't treat all humans as they ought to be treated. So we develop our agency in conditions of injustice. Under conditions of structural injustice, we are situated in relation to at least some other human beings in ways in which they're not being treated as they should be treated. But we can't do something about that as individuals in particular individual actions. But it can mean that in all of our particular individual actions, our options for acting are flawed or compromised. So consider the conditions under which the clothing we wear is made, what the production and packaging of the food we eat does to animals and ecosystems, the plastic that it's almost impossible to avoid using, wars your country is involved in or has funded through its arms trade, the history of acquisition with respect to any property or wealth you own, the child labor and war in the Congo that might have been involved in the acquisition of the cobalt in your mobile phone. Is there a morally untainted option with respect to getting dressed and feeding yourself today? I actually think there isn't. Now, you can't change these structural conditions through some particular individual action. That's what it means to say that they're structural. But if all your options for acting are ones which involve treating people in ways in which they shouldn't be treated and have a right not to be treated, I think it's hard to fully make sense of your way of being in the world. It's hard to fully make sense of your way of living. And I think this affects our agency because it interacts with this very fundamental need to make sense and to see yourself as oriented to the good. So the intuitive idea here is that if you live in a world in which what you have and your ways of life are implicated in current and historical injustice, it's hard to take this on while continuing to see yourself as basically good, coherent, oriented to the good. And I think because of this, we have a tendency to screen off from our awareness entitlements of others that are inconsistent with ways of living which we're embedded in. So in conditions in which our ways of living don't fully make sense or treat everybody as they have a right to be treated, we've got a strong interest in self-deception, even delusional ideology. We find ways of rationalizing and seeing ourselves as entitled to what we have. And I think this damages us as moral agents. Okay, so put our need to interpret ourselves as basically making sense and oriented to the good, together with coming to agency as a needy, self-centered, vulnerable, massive desires, guided by imperfect people who don't know how best to help you recognize what you've done wrong and how that's compatible with still seeing yourself as lovable, and doing this under conditions of structural injustice. Okay, so I think that our being flawed is deep, structural, and not easy to eradicate. And this can make it difficult to even get going on moral progress, because it's all your attempts are implicated in this problematic self. That's why moral progress has got so many pitfalls of self-righteousness and arrogance and anger and policing and all these things. And I think something that I think that follows from this is that when we try to come to terms with our own wrongdoing, we're very liable to lurch between two unhelpful responses: leniency and despair. So really taking on board your wrongdoing, it indicates something about who you are. This can lead to despair or bad faith, where you just give up on trying to be better because you just decide this is just who I am. This is just who I inevitably are. You might think there's just nothing I can do to make it the case that I'm not the kind of person who could have done this thing because I did this thing. And this just shows what I am, what I'm capable of. And the thing is, in fact, something you're capable of. You did it. But despair and bad faith incapacitate rather than leading to attempts to be better. So a tempting but problematic way of avoiding this despair is leniency with ourselves. So mistaking an apology and a desire to be different with already being the better person that our apology indicates that we think we should be. And this can be an obstacle to actually doing the work of orienting ourselves to better willing, learning to manage ourselves better. And it can show insufficient regard for the concerns of those who we've wronged. We need to take the wrong and what it says about us seriously, without this leading to us giving up hope of being better. And forgiveness, as I understand it, is a way in which we can help each other do this. And I think it's something with respect to which we need help. So the Christian idea of grace includes the idea that we can't overcome our flawed natures on our own. We need this external help. Now, I'm not trying to appeal to a supernatural idea because I'm trying to give a secular account. But what we still have here, I think, is the idea that forgiving is a kind of an external help that we can give each other to help each other make moral progress without falling into the pitfalls of despair and leniency. When someone forgives us and communicates this, they generously see us in a hopeful, open way in which the wrongdoing is not taken to reflect on us. And this can help us hold on to being oriented to being this better way, allowing us to take the wrongdoing seriously while having a hopeful view of ourselves as not forever stained by the action. So forgiving, I think, involves taking a view of another that takes their wrongdoing seriously, but sees them in a more positive, hopeful, or optimistic light than their wrongdoing indicates. And what I think makes this possible or not irrational is that we don't have fixed characters. We're not like machines. We're free to make better choices. It is possible for them to be this better way in which you're seeing them. So a human agent, I think, is not a fixed, determinate character, but a messy, partially unified work in progress, constantly determining themselves by their choices, constantly engaged in a struggle, possibly of trying to be better or to manage them yourself, including being honest, trying to be honest with yourself. And I think it's flawed agents, works in progress, without an entirely fixed and stable character, for whom forgiveness is a live option and a need. And I think this is the context in which forgiveness has an important role. It's a hopeful view of a person that interprets them as oriented to better willing than their action indicated them to be. And this is something they can be, and seeing them in this way can help them hold on to being in this way. Victoria McGee, a Canadian philosopher, argues that it's a feature of human agency that individuals are very often empowered by interacting with others who believe in them, especially others who are willing to act in trustful reliance on what they can do, or be fueled by the energy of what others hope for them. She says this vision creates for them a kind of affectively charged scaffolding, empowering their own sense of potential agency with the energy of our hope, and thus encouraging them to act in ways commensurate with the vision we maintain. And she says the advantage of this is clear. Instead of thinking, I want to be like her, like somebody else altogether, the galvanizing thought that drives us forward is seemingly more immediate and reachable. I want to be as she already sees me to be. So I think that this optimistic or hopeful way in which you can see another is a way in which we can take wrongdoing seriously while helping each other avoid despair and leniency, both of which don't help moral progress. And this enables us to move forward together without being forever defined by our worst moments. In forgiving, we express this optimistic, hopeful view to others. We give them what I think is a genuine gift, something that a gift of evaluating them better than their action indicates them to be, but in a way in which it is possible for them to be. But we don't have to do this. We're entitled to see people in the light of what their actions tell us about their willing. And they're not entitled to demand or assert that we don't. We don't owe it to people to see them as better than their actions indicate them to be. And they aren't entitled to claim it. Someone who insists that we ought to forgive them, especially after repeat offenses with little indication of change, may be adding insult to injury, because first they wrong you, and then they insist that you not see this as informing your view of them. If they keep doing the thing, but then keep asking you to regard them as not informed by it, this might be a way of just entrenching their lack of change. And we've got a lot of other options in relationships. We can go a long way with justifying, excusing, accepting, coming to understand, moving on, shelving it. There's an Australian philosopher who just does a lot of work saying we don't need forgiveness, we just need shelving it, Simone Gubler. And I think we're entitled to expect wrongdoers to meet conditions, like apologies and amends, or even demonstrating real commitment to change. Changing our affective appraisals of somebody only when they've proved that they've earned it, I think that's a legitimate practice, fits in with the practice of moral bookkeeping. And I think that moral bookkeeping has a role to play in our mutual accountability practices. But I think that the most significant role of forgiveness is in transcending moral bookkeeping. Rather than being a required recognition of what a person has earned or what they deserve, forgiveness sees a wrongdoer in an open, hopeful, more positive way than her wrongdoing warrants. And this is something which I think, at least often, goes beyond the evidence. So this sort of idea of openness or going beyond the evidence is something which a lot of philosophers writing on trust have noted about trust. Victoria McGeer, again, is one of those who says that substantial trust involves making or maintaining judgments about others that go beyond the evidence. So trust isn't just a calculated risk taking under conditions of uncertainty. It's an attitude of confidence, but it's going beyond the evidence. She says trust renounces the very process of weighing whatever evidence there is in a cool and disengaged and purportedly objective way. If somebody's constantly weighing the evidence, they're not trusting you. And I think that this is also true of forgiveness. I think it goes beyond the evidence, and this relates to our nature as free and responsible agents, which I think goes back to the role that Arendt was attributing to forgiveness. So there was this puzzling stuff in this Arendt quote about that this is necessary to remain free agents, to begin something anew. And I think that part of what makes forgiveness so special and powerful and meaningful is how it genuinely allows us to see each other as actually able to make a fresh start, as to move forward, not seeing each other as defined by our worst actions. So, and Arendt is saying that this is actually needed for meaningful free agency. Now, we can't change the past. You can't make it the case that you didn't do a thing. You can't make it the case that not having an act held to your account is what you deserve or what you're due. It's not illegitimate for me to say that this thing you did tells me something about who you are, and I'm entitled to keep a note of this. It is something you're capable of, and I can keep a little proportionate note about that. But I think the wronged person can help release the wrongdoer from this act in no longer seeing them in a way that holds it to them. This release, as I understand it, involves an openness of view in which the wrongdoer is seen in the light of better willing than their action indicates. So our choices do reflect on us. They are how we form ourselves. So that they do create the self who now acts. But in seeing a person in a way that frees them from being tied to a particular past action, I think that gifted forgiveness allows a view of the person as free to be better, despite what they've done, to act in a way that goes beyond the conditioning of their past choices, and that this can help them to actually be this better self. And I think that we need this interpersonally. I think we need to be able to move forward with people in not always seeing each other as defined by our worst actions. And I think we also need it politically. We need to see people, including our political opponents, as not fixed by their worst actions and choices, and as capable of being better. So I was talking about the way, as I see it, we have a fundamental need to see ourselves as making sense and as oriented to the good. And I said that this can lead to self-deception and delusion because we find ways of seeing ourselves as entitled. But I think this need to see ourselves as oriented to the good can also be a source of hope. Because even people in the grip of a pernicious and delusional ideology usually have a conception of the good to which they're oriented, which we can try to understand. They're not necessarily terrible people. Kant expresses this in saying that even in the worst person, there can still be some orientation to the good. And I think that thinking about how our ways of life might be implicated in current and historical wrongdoing and injustice is painful. And shame leads to wanting to look away and to deny that we're implicated in this. And this can lead to failure to pay enough attention to the dark sides of ourselves, but also the dark sides of our histories. But I think this is damaging to our moral characters and to our understanding of the world. So finding a way to pay attention to these features while holding on to the idea that this doesn't mean that we're all bad, so that the shame doesn't trigger totally looking away, might enable us to pay better attention to the atrocities and injustices which our present ways of life are implicated in, to live with our past more honestly, and so to remember better. Now, stop there.
First of all, thank you. Thank you for the great lecture. I think you gave several answers to this question, but I wanted to ask that whether forgiveness needs to have a forgivee, forgiving person, and also maybe ask for forgiveness as a catalyst to exist, and also what are the triggers of forgiveness, basically?
Great, thanks for that. So just let me know if I haven't understood your first question correctly. So whether forgiver needs to have somebody who's being forgiven. So I think forgiveness needs to have somebody who's done something wrong, but it could be yourself. So I think self-forgiveness is very complicated and raises all sorts of tricky questions, but I think that is a possibility, but then that is a forgivee, I guess. So maybe you can say a bit more.
Yeah, no, that's correct. Like someone who has done the wrongdoing, and that's the forgivee basically. Yeah, and is there a need for ask as well?
For that person to ask for
yeah,
forgiveness.
exactly.
So I don't think so. And this also relates to your question about triggers about forgiveness. So in the philosophical literature about forgiveness, there's a lot of debate about what forgiveness is. And people have all these different accounts. Some people think it's a change of heart, like I do. And some people will say it's something else. It's like a ritual of apologizing and accepting apologies, or waiving the requirement that the person make amends. And then there's some people who respond to that by saying, let's just be pluralists. Why not say all these things are forgiveness? And my account, I'm not a pluralist about what forgiveness is. I think it's this stopping to hold something against someone affectively, and of giving an account of that. But I'm completely ecumenical about everything else. So I think you can forgive, you can require apologies, and you can wait for someone to ask, but you also don't have to. You can forgive someone who you never see again. I think you can forgive the dead. I think you can forgive without apologies. And then I think that the triggers can also be just completely different. Some people, some people really struggle to forgive in particular cases, and it's meaningful to them, and they try, but they find it really hard. And other people might just forgive really easily and instantly, or in some cases, easily and instantly. So I think there's an enormous variety about that, about what triggers forgiveness, about how easy you find it, about what kinds of reasons you want to require before you forgive, about whether or not somebody needs to ask for forgiveness. I'm sort of completely ecumenical about all of that, but I want to argue that it is this sort of specific thing that can be done for all these different reasons.
Yeah, and I think so. It is irrespective of the wrongdoer. Then, if we can forgive the dead, then
it's irrespective of anything that they've done, but it is them that you're forgiving. It's an orientation to that person. And I think, and that's meaningful to people. People, grapple with thinking about, their parents, or, people who are dead. And so I think that's meaningful, and it is an orientation to that person.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So the worry I have is that this account that what the person forgiving me if I've done wrong gives me is this release. They encourage me to see myself in a better way, open to change, all this. I don't quite see why it's they who have that particular power rather than anybody else to do that for me. So if I've wronged you, why does it have to be they who can forgive me? Why can't my friends say to me, I see the way in which what you did to them was wrong, but why can't they provide that to me?
So I think it's a great question, and I think they can provide some of that. And I think it's partly just a psychological fact that it's the person you wronged from whom you want this, or from whom that this is really meaningful in many cases. But sometimes, if they're not available anymore, or they're just completely, won't deal with you in any way, you can get help from other people. So it's not that you can't get help from other people, but I think that, and therefore there are sort of similar affective changes or affective appraisals that other people give us. But I just think that we use the word forgiveness for this case where the person who's been wronged has this particular change in relation to the person who's wronged them, and that in many cases that's something that is meaningful to both parties in that kind of relationship.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Hi. What role can forgiveness have where the person A sees as the wrongdoer, but the person who did that thing doesn't think it's wrong?
So it's a great question, and very complicated. So forgiveness is at issue when you think that somebody's wronged you. And you can be wrong about that. And that can be contested. When you're, in Miranda Fricker's account of constructive blame, she's sort of defending that blame can have a constructive role. But sometimes you can just be wrong. The person pushes back and they get you to see that you weren't wrong. But it also means that forgiveness can be a kind of a power move.
Okay, I'm not meaning like where there was a justification or so, but where, so say for you, honesty is something that's very important, and for them, it isn't. So they say, yes, I have habitually lied to you, but what's the problem? I don't see that that's a problem. And so you've got this this big difference in values.
So one thing I think you're trying to do in sort of interchanges of communicative blame, you're trying to get to increased alignment of values. You're trying to get the person to understand why this thing bothers you, why you care about it, why it's important to you. And you can fail. And then if you fail, you've then got, a further question for yourself. How do I move forward with this person? Do I want to move forward with this person? Am I going to just decide to accept that this person just one of those people who tells you what they think you want to hear? And you think that that's really problematic, but that's who they are, and either you're going to move forward with them accepting that that's who they are, or you're not. So in those situations, I almost think that forgiveness is not really the thing that's at issue. The thing that's at issue is, can I accept this or not? Can we get increased alignment of values? And if we can't, can I accept this lack of alignment, or can I not? Do I just not want to move forward with this person? In the other kinds of cases which I first thought you were talking about, the fact that forgiveness involves an assertion that the person has done something wrong means that it can actually be accusatory. So in David Copperfield, Uriah Heep is always going around saying, Master Copperfield, I forgive you, when he's the one who's wronging David Copperfield. He's saying, Master Copperfield, I forgive you. And that I forgive you is an assertion, you did something wrong, but I'm being generous. So it can be this kind of power play in its assertion that you've done something wrong. But that's a different issue to what you were talking about.
I just want to, just ask again, do you, for you, is the change in effective attitude what the thing that you take from this? Because it seems that the rest of it is a gift to the other person, right? To the person that you're forgiving. So what do you take from the act of forgiving somebody?
So I actually take quite seriously and take increasingly seriously the idea that a person is a person to other person's idea, that these affective attitudes that we have between each other are part of who we are. So I think this is how we are moving forward together. And in that context, so I think forgiveness is its sort of central role is in interpersonal relationships. And I think that loving someone involves interpreting them in the light of the good. And so I think it's part of loving someone. So that you're willing, so of course accepting is also, so it's not always forgiving. But I think that being willing to let someone move forward in a way that isn't defined by this wrong that they've done is part of your being with them and moving forward. So I think that is also for you, but I think that is really importantly about them. So I do want to push back on this, the inspirational quote theme that is all about forgiving isn't about them, it's just something you do for yourself.
It seems that what you're suggesting that you're also changing by that process of forgiving somebody. You're almost becoming, let's say, a bigger person.
You could be. So sometimes I think that wrongdoing that is really dealt with well, where you've really tried to understand the other person's, where two people have really tried to understand each other's concerns, achieved aligned values, which doesn't always happen, but if it does, you can come out of it really knowing each other better. So that could also be something that's in it.
Thank you for the talk. Just a very quick one. Are there any limits to forgiveness?
So Going back to my answer to the very first question, I'm inclined to be ecumenical about that in general, but I think that individual people are entitled to have limits, and individual people will have judgments about things that they think are unforgivable, and I think they're entitled to, but I don't see a way of sort of ruling for everyone on that. And I think there are people who, who might forgive more, or might have different limits, or so I think I wouldn't rule on that.
Thank you for your talk, by the way. One thing I was just wondering is that part of the process of forgiveness is actually letting go of the effect of that person doing the wrong to you. Does that make sense?
So I think that does make sense, but I think you can also achieve that without forgiving. So I think, somebody who you think is incorrigible and you don't want to move forward with, and you actually want to separate yourself from, but it's necessary for your own mental health to not be dwelling on them and to just sort of let go on this, how this affects you. I think you can do that on your own without forgiving them through, but maybe for some people forgiveness is the most helpful way of achieving that. But you can put somebody out of your mind, you can meditate, you can, so I think that can be an important feature of forgiveness, but I think you can achieve it without forgiving.
Thanks for a really compelling talk. I was interested by this aspect of going beyond the evidence that you brought out as key to forgiveness. And I was thinking about, so a heroic sort of instance of forgiveness is one that we might see as particularly praiseworthy, but also one that goes particularly beyond the evidence of, sort of very generous act of forgiveness. Does that mean that we've just kicked the can of like the irrationality of this act onto the question of whether the hope is irrational or not? It seems that that hope is a very, very generous hope, that in spite of all the evidence, I'm going to forgive this person anyway. Well, that does seem like a very praiseworthy act of forgiveness, but possibly not especially rational. Perhaps might seem like it's going beyond the evidence even more.
So I think that hope requires only possibility to be rational. It doesn't require likelihood. So I think it's not irrational, but I think that it's not straightforwardly irrational. But in many cases, you wouldn't want to in those circumstances. So, and that's true of lots of attitudes that go beyond the evidence. So I think trust goes beyond the evidence, but trust can also be broken by the evidence. And trust can be badly placed. Forgiveness, I think, is a little bit different in that I think you can forgive on the basis of a belief in the possibility of a person's change. And I think that people do talk about forgiveness like that, talk about it as if it's meaningful to them. So in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is criticized for talking too much about forgiveness and wasn't actually about forgiveness, but there were some sort of noteworthy instances of, somebody saying, wanting to find out who was the murderer, what happened to her father, saying, we want to forgive, but we don't know who to forgive. Or the widows of Eugene de Kock, who, abducted and tortured them and many other people who said they forgave. And what do they mean exactly? What do they take themselves to be saying? I don't take them to be saying, like, they think he's like totally cool now. I think they take themselves to be saying that they think he's a person and there's some hope for a person. So not that he's fine, but that they're seeing him as better than his wrongdoing indicates. And that doesn't mean seeing him as, totally sordid. It means better. And seeing him as somebody who'd done what he had done, seeing him as capable of change, that's already I think, quite generous. So I think it's complicated what exactly is going on. And I think in these really extreme cases, it can just involve I think you're still a person, and I think change is still possible, and you can be this better thing. But it doesn't have to involve thinking that this person is totally changed. Something like that.
Hi, just leading on from that, I can see what you're saying, that you need to have some hope that this person can change. But what if that person does not recognize the wrongdoing at all? Do you need to have, does it have to be two-way to some extent? So you want to forgive somebody, but they don't even recognize the need for that forgiveness because they don't see any basis upon which they need forgiveness. Can you forgive them even if you're not having that reciprocity at all?
So, because I'm very ecumenical about the reasons for forgiving, I don't want to rule that out as impossible, but it is sort of puzzling. Why do you want to do that? It doesn't look like you. So it could be. So I think people do this. You can think about a parent who keeps forgiving their completely incorrigible child who keeps doing terrible things, but they keep sort of believing in the best. But now this does start looking like you do want to question the rationality of it at some point. I think that it's not necessarily not rational because it is possible at each point that this person could be better, but you want to ask yourself, why are you seeing them? Why do you want to see them in this better way? Why, what's going on when you're wanting to do that? Because I think that, so I've argued that forgiveness and the kind of change that I think it involves plays an important role in our lives. But I think that seeing people in the light of their actions also plays a really important role in our lives. So I think forgiveness, it's puzzling, I think, because it's special. It's not what we're doing all the time. We are evaluating each other in the light of what our actions say about us. And if you never see if the way you see a person is never informed by their actions, I think you're not taking them seriously as a person. So I think those kinds of cases are puzzling. I wouldn't say they can't be made sense of. And I think one can do that, but you would want to sort of ask yourself, what are you doing and why? Is there more communication with this person that is needed rather than?
I suppose you're assuming that the person, the forgiver, is to some extent quite a rational person.
That the forgiver is irrational. Is rational.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So you're thinking they might just not be.
All sorts of people might feel that, a bit like your example in literature, they might feel like, oh, I forgive you. Well, there's really nothing to forgive. So in your examples, this person has a rational reason to feel that the person has wronged them and therefore, but has the capacity to be better, therefore they can forgive them. But if actually that person is not rational, there isn't actually, this other person hasn't actually done anything which requires forgiving, then the whole theory of forgiveness just doesn't work.
Yes.
So you do need some reciprocity. You need both sides to have something invested in the situation. It can't be entirely one-sided.
Except that I do think you can forgive the dead. And I also do think you can forgive someone in your heart without telling them. You might think in some cases that it would be bad for them to be told that you've forgiven them, but actually you have.
In which case, it could be entirely in your head, this whole thing about having to forgive. It could be entirely one-sided.
Well, I think it's a change in the forgiver with respect to the wrongdoer. And the forgiver can make that change on their own, I think.
I suppose my question is, do you really need a wrongdoer?
Right, the first question. I think so, because I think maybe I just sort of take that as axiomatic, that forgiving is a response to wrongdoing.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's fascinating. Andy, and puzzling. Is it possible to forgive a nation? I'm assuming that quite a lot of what we've talked about this evening is on an individual level, but can nations forgive?
can nations forgive or can nations be forgiven?
Both, either.
So nations are artificial persons, and so they can do things. They can act. They can, declare war or make something illegal, so they can do things. I think it's sort of a bit harder for me to see how a nation can forgive, because I think a nation can act as an artificial person, but as an artificial person it doesn't have feelings. But one has feelings towards a nation. So, I mean, I think what you'd want to sort of think a little bit more about exactly what we think is going on in that kind of case. But so you might say something like, you're coming to terms with how you feel about this nation at the same time as having hope for their being better, or significantly engaging with their being better in some way. That seems sort of quite analogous, I would think, if not exactly the same. So it's going to be different because, artificial persons don't have feelings and we don't interact with them in the same way. But they do act, and they can be better or worse, and they can improve, and we have feelings towards them. And so I think there's something in the vicinity.
Yeah, listening to all the questions, and my first question, I feel like in general we tend to find excuses for not forgiving. Well, maybe it's just my observation, but why do you think people are conservative in terms of forgiving?
So I think some people might be and some people might not be. Some people might even forgive. You might think that some people forgive too easily and too often. Like the parent is always forgiving their incorrigible child. I think we do have groups of people who we don't want to interpret in the light of the good. And then I think I think there's variation between individuals about how much we enjoy holding grudges. But I think that genuinely varies. But I think we particularly our political opponents, we don't want to interpret in the light of the good. So I think there are groups of people who we are quite resistant to wanting to forgive. And there are people who are quite incorrigible.
And I think that needs to be the last question, but let's thank Lucy once again for fascinating talk.